The Jane Millen Doe, also known as Jenkins County Jane Doe, identified as Chong Un Kim. This case begins on Sunday afternoon on Valentine's Day, February 14, 1988, in Millen, Georgia. This is one of those cases where it was very lucky that someone was found at all. It was at this time that a man was looking for cans to recycle, and he would find himself looking inside of the dumpster that's shown here. While he was looking for cans, his girlfriend was waiting in the car. This was off Kaiser Road, which is now the bypass area, and Old Perkins Road in Millen. It was at this time they observed there was a large duffel bag inside. They did decide to go ahead and look inside the duffel, and inside they found a woman, wrapped in plastic that was sealed using duct tape. They didn't, however, report to authorities what they found. Instead, they went and picked up a friend and returned to the dumpster. It doesn't specifically say, but I suspect they weren't sure the contents were really what they were. After returning with the friend, they contacted the police. They would explain right before they approached the dumpster, they had observed a small brown vehicle at that scene. Another person would come forward to say they smelled what they believed to be a decomposing body. As the police investigated, they found 2 children who also saw a small brown vehicle at that garbage can, saying they were there 2 days earlier, however. The children would say they saw a middle-aged couple throwing things into the dumpster and a woman crying out for my baby. If it was the same vehicle, it's possible they were checking to see if anyone had found her. The GBI had the entire dumpster taken into their headquarters, and inside it they found bedding and a towel inside garbage bags that they believed were related to the duffel bag. Due to the pickup schedule of the dumpster, police determined that it had been previously emptied on a Friday, and she was found on Sunday. This would mean she'd been placed inside of the garbage receptacle on or after February 12, 1988. The examination would determine she was likely Hispanic. However, a later examination would find that she was likely of Eastern Asian descent and that she was likely 20 to 30 years old. They believed her life had been taken 4 to 7 days before she was found. The town of Millen is actually pretty small. They had a population of around 3,500 at the time she was found. There was a very small Asian population in this town, less than half of a percentage point. They had no clear indication of her COD, and although they believed it was probably asphyxiation, there were no signs of trauma other than her feet had been tied together, which they believe happened while she was still alive. She was healthy, and she hadn't taken any drugs. There was no indication of SA either. She did have a missing tooth. They believed it had been extracted by a dentist, which means it was possible that she didn't have the funds to take care of the tooth. At the time she was found, DNA had been used for an SA that had occurred in UK 2 years earlier, in 1986, but it hadn't ever been used for identification. And the system for DNA crimes didn't start till 1994. So in 1998, they had no idea that cremating her might have doomed her to being forever an unidentified person. And that's just what they did. They cremated her. There was a group of mostly Hispanic migrant workers who had relocated to Georgia in 1988. And they thought maybe it was somehow related. However, they also believed that the people had left the area 2 weeks prior to Jane Doe's, and none of those people were reported missing. A man named Johnny Young was the subject of a tip that was called in, suggesting he was involved. He was 23 in 1988, and the tip came in pretty quickly. He'd lived in Millen, but he'd arrived there from Orlando, Florida, with a large suitcase on the 9th of February. During his interrogation, he originally denied having anything to do with it, asking the investigator if it was his uncle who called in the tip. This was, of course, a great lead to the uncle, who told the police his nephew was involved in moving illicit substances. A local woman would inform them that Young had made the acquaintance of a woman who was likely of Puerto Rican heritage, and she had left with Young after he stole from someone else. The tipster had said she feared that Jane Doe was that woman. However, when the police approached the tipster who had given her name, she denied being the one who made the tip at all. In 1991, the police received a phone call from someone taking responsibility for our Jane Doe. The man was believed to be Johnny Young, who I just mentioned. The police would again approach Mr. Young, and he would deny calling the police or admitting fault. He then blamed his uncle and another individual for that phone call. The police kept investigating Mr. Young and keeping an eye on him, eventually speaking to another relative who would say that they picked him up after his trip from Orlando, saying there was carpeting in his bedroom similar to the fiber found on our Jane Doe. and it is noted that the suitcase he had with him may have been large enough to have even transported her from Orlando to Georgia, in hopes of keeping her unidentified. At this point, Johnny Young was the best lead, but it's all they had, and there was no proof. The police would examine the case again in 1998, hoping they could solve it. They found a brownish gold carpet fiber that had stuck to the tape that had circled our Jane Doe's body. They would also determine the sketch of the female was not an accurate depiction. I'll post both later with her true photograph as a comparison. While I think the first sketch looks to me like she's Hispanic, which they did believe her to be originally, the mouth is still very accurate. They would develop a new recreation in hopes of getting closer to an accurate depiction. They received more tips, but none panned out. One such tip suggested there was a man who took the lives of several in the area, and he had a girlfriend of Asian heritage who reportedly disappeared after the crime. While that was a legitimate case, they were unable to tie our Jane Doe to that at all. A re-examining of the bedding appeared to have originated from a household versus a hotel. They estimated the design as most likely belonging to a young adult. They developed a theory that she was perhaps a foreign national who had entered the U.S. without documentation. They believed this in part because Atlanta is a port city and immigrants sometimes arrive here. They believe it's possible she could have been a victim of human trafficking. They would note that usually in that case, it is women of Chinese descent. These women are generally brought in to work in massage parlors that are located off the highways, often visited by truckers. And it's not unusual for these women to not only fall victim to being forced to do this, but to have their lives taken. They noted in those cases, many described the sheets as embroidered. I believe this is why it's noted that the sheets found with her did not have any embroidery. It's stated that one investigator tried to trace the manufacturer of the bedding to North or South Korea, but there was no follow-up, so it probably wasn't successful. Over the years, they definitely made a lot of efforts to try to identify her, but it just didn't work. As per usual with cases like this, there were allegations throwing out all kinds of serials. I don't even want to say their names. I hate bringing them up. I feel like I need to mention that there were some suggestions, but I think they just throw these out all of the time, and the truth is they don't know who took her life. Like so many of these cases, DNA advancements could change everything with that also. There definitely was DNA on some of the items that were submitted so far, but they weren't able to get complete DNA from anything, so it's possible more may come up. Othrum's cost for processing this case was provided by Project Justice. And it was with this they would learn this was Chong Eun Kim of Hinesville, Liberty County, Georgia. Hinesville is just 91 miles, or about 147 kilometers away from Millen, Georgia. Johnny Young, who they believe may have taken her life, has since passed away. Chong Eun Kim was found 91 miles or 147 kilometers from home. She went unidentified for 35 years. Had she lived the life she deserved, she would be 61 years old today. The Davie Jane Doe, identified as Lori Jane Kearsey. This one begins in Davie, Florida, on February 18, 1984. A person was walking by a canal in a rural area that is listed as the 2600 block of Southwest 130th Avenue in Davie. It was here they noticed what appeared to be a person floating in the water. The area has more going on there now, but in 1984 it was basically a bunch of orange groves alongside of a canal. Upon examination, it was determined there was foul play. She had blonde hair and a gap between her two front teeth. To fill that gap, a dentist had put in some sort of composite material between the two teeth to hide the gap. She had denim Foxy Trail brand jean shorts, but her top half was unclothed, and she had been asphyxiated. The thing about this, too, is that our Jane Doe is not the only woman found in the area canals at that time. Another woman, for instance, was found only 2 miles away. In that case, she was identified as Carrie Weldron, and she had been found in March of 1985, which is the year after our Jane Doe was found. And this was on the corner of Southwest 121st Avenue and Southwest 36th Street. Her COD was different, however. It's listed as vehicular. Her case is still unsolved and needs someone to call in on the tip line. But those 2 times also were not the only times in the canal. 3 years after our Jane Doe, a third woman was found, and her name was Marilyn Decker, also found in Davie, Florida. This was October 25th, 1987. So we are talking 1984, 85, and 87. The final woman, Marilyn Decker, was found at the 3000 block of Flamingo Road just a few miles away. She too was asphyxiated, but she was also with what I'll just say on here was a sharp implement, starting with a K. Her case also remains unsolved. And in the third case, her family would say that she was hanging out with the wrong crowd, but had been hiding it from them. So this may be similar with the other cases. It's hard to say. The same number for Crime Stoppers works for all three cases. So if anyone has information on any of them, it's important. The police went on to say that all these cases were in vacant areas at the time without buildings or witnesses. It was pretty easy for whoever it was who dumped the women, whether it's one person or multiple people. It also states that the area they were found in was actually considered part of the Everglades at the time. So the question remains as to whether these women are related or not, if it was some sort of a coincidence. I'd love to know what you think. It seems entirely plausible to me that they could be related. On the plus side, in the end, all three women were at least identified. Although with our Jane Doe, it took a little bit longer. In her case, the case kept dragging on concerning her identity, and they would eventually send it to Parabon Nanolabs. This would eventually lead to Lori Jane Kearsey's daughter, Megan Smith, someone who'd been searching for her mother all of this time. Cece Moore, who many are familiar with from her work with Parabon, first contacted Lori's sister, who was shown the recreation here. From that recreation, she was pretty sure that she had found what happened to Lori. The final match would come with a link from Lori's daughter, who would say she always knew something happened to her mother, that she hadn't just walked away. She would say growing up she was told that her family hadn't heard from her since 1983, after she left Massachusetts. This was, of course, before she was found, but it's hard to say exactly when she went missing. Memory can be faulty, and it was a long time ago. We know that Lori grew up in Massachusetts. We know that Megan's father met her mother in a nightclub when Megan's mom was just 17. The two never married, and she would later go on to marry a man who she met in 1982, while she worked at a different nightclub in the area, eventually marrying into what is described as a prominent and notorious crime family from Boston, although they do not name the family she married into. This, of course, gives the police a place to start looking, maybe just for Lori's case, but maybe for all of the women. That said, she was found about 1,500 miles or 2,400 kilometers from where she'd lived. It's definitely a long way to transport somebody. So there's probably more to the story. It's not a small distance. It'd take about 23 hours to drive nonstop from where it's believed she started to where she was found. But one article mentions her leaving Massachusetts. This one's a little bit twisted up as far as the facts go, so please take it all with a grain of salt. We do know that Lori was 23 when her life was taken, though I'm not sure how old she was when she was married or how long she was married. She was last seen by her family on Thanksgiving Day in 1983. Two different stories of what happened to her would be given to Megan, her daughter, about her mom over the years as Megan grew up. Both of those stories would have her leaving Massachusetts. One of her aunts would say that Lori's best friend's husband dropped her off at the airport. However, others would say she was picked up by law enforcement with a suggestion that she may have entered the witness protection program, which is something most of her family seemed to believe had happened, which would explain why she was not in contact. Law enforcement now doesn't know what to believe about it, saying there were a lot of rumors, and right now they're trying to find the truth in them. No one knows for sure how Lori left, or even when, or why. However, they would say that they have identified a person of interest in the case who is still alive, though so far that name has not been released. Lori's daughter Megan would speak out at her relief of finally knowing what happened to her mom, saying she's overwhelmed with the knowledge. She had actually pretty much resigned herself to believing that she would never know what happened to her mom. She said she often agonized over what her mother may have gone through, but all she knows for sure is her mom dropped her off for a weekend and didn't come back. Megan is now a mother herself. The rumor or belief that law enforcement picked her up is the reason that Lori wasn't reported missing. I've provided the number for Crime Stoppers, and that number applies to all three cases. All of them deserve justice. Lori Kearsey's case, outside of her identification, has gone unsolved for 39 years. Carrie's case has gone unsolved for 38 years. Marilyn Decker's case has gone unsolved for 36 years. May they rest in peace. Lori Jane Kearsey went unidentified for 39 years. The Spokane John Doe, identified as Clifford Bippes. On July 3, 1989, in Spokane, Washington, an employee was working at a landfill moving dirt around with a bulldozer, and he had the plan of moving some debris found there. It was inside that debris that he would find the remains of a person. It's not clear how long the man had been there. It could be 1 to 3 weeks, but he was noted as not being in a recognizable condition. They got the best fingerprints that they could, but they were limited as far as the technology for reading them at the time. He had some broken bones, but that may have happened because of the bulldozer. They were, however, able to get images of his tattoos. His recreation by Carl Koppelman is the one that I know I've seen many times. The situation at the landfill is different now than it was then. Today, the landfill is private and inaccessible outside of open hours, likely in part for this type of reason. Back then, however, it was only maintained by employees every 2 or 3 weeks. It seems like way too often this happens and they're probably not found. So as sad as it is, it was lucky he was found. I know a case in my state, there's a missing girl where her jacket was found at the dump, but she wasn't found at all. They had hoped his tattoos would help identify him. He had a snake on his right bicep, another snake, branch, panther, and wolf head on his right arm. He also had a tattoo of an eagle with Blue River and mountains in the background on his left forearm. Detectives did all they could. They went to all of the local tattoo parlors in the area in hopes of locating an artist who recognized their work, as well as who the man was. Illustrations were shown on the local news. He was 40 to 65 and around 5'6" or 168 centimeters with a receding hairline. The tattoos were probably the best clue, but no one identified him. In 2002, he would be entered into CODIS, but there was still no movement on the case, unfortunately. Thankfully, this is another one that Othram Labs took on, and Othram is located in Texas, and they're at the forefront of a lot of these identifications. Othram and Parabon do a lot of these, but there's new ones like Moxie Labs and Astria Forensics, just to name a few. And then they, of course, upload to public databases to try to find who someone was. And in this case, a close match would pop up. And that's usually, of course, the easiest path to a name once you have a close match. But unfortunately, in this case, it led to a son who had been given up for adoption and was actually in the database hoping to find his biological parents.
It's kind of like a closure. I mean, you figure it out, you know. I mean, I've probably been searching maybe 15 years, somewhere around there, just off and on in spurts.
A 34-year-old mystery solved and a man found dead in a Spokane landfill identified at last. It all began when a man searching for answers about his biological father got a call from all the way across the country. It was the Spokane County Medical Examiner's Office, as he tells our Help Me Haley. He didn't hesitate to pick up the phone and wasn't entirely surprised to see a Spokane number pop up.
Yeah, this incredible development, truly a combined effort with thousands of miles in between those working to get some answers.
I've been searching and I looked and I've been on 23andMe and Ancestry and a bunch of different other sites. And then I found certain relatives and that was close to me, and I kind of knew my biological mom had went out west.
For more than a decade, 43-year-old Matt Cunningham had been on a hunt for simply answers.
It was more about finding out who you look like, where your traits come from, because when I was adopted, I got a great family, and I couldn't ask for anything more.
He says he entered his DNA into a genetic genealogy database, and from there began connecting a possible family tree. Many leads were out west. That's why when a 509 area code popped up on his phone, he answered. It was the Spokane County ME's office on the other line. More tests were needed to confirm it, including narrowing it down further and revealing his biological father's sister. Samples for reference testing made it official.
They said, we're 100% sure that Clifford Bippes is your biological father.
Clifford Cliff Wayne Bippes, oldest of 3 siblings, an Army veteran, likely 45 years old when he died. His sister tells me he had his struggles, but will forever be remembered as a happy guy.
Clifford was 44 when he disappeared in January of 1989, and he was found 6 months later in July of 1989. And he was in the same area he went missing from. Before social media, of course, they were showing tattoos on the news and perhaps in newspapers. So it didn't always get to the people that they were looking for. So even though it was in the same town, no identification was made. His sister would say she knew something was wrong when he didn't contact her on her birthday. So this does imply he was in somewhat regular contact with his family, if not really close. But probably the biggest hurdle and what kept him from getting identified so quickly is the last time that his family saw him, he did not have any tattoos. Or if he did, they were covered by clothing. So while tattoos are often an easier path to identification, in this case, it probably stopped it. His sister eventually had a headstone with his name on it, placed in 1991 to honor him. By then, she believed there was no way that he was still alive. His sister would share that Clifford served in the U.S. Army and is the oldest of 3 children in that family. He was born in Washington in 1943.
As for Matt, he says his biological family has brought up a possible in-person meeting down the line.
And if the occasion arises, and everything works out in life, and it happens for a reason. So if that's what's meant to be, we'll plan a meeting.
Cliff's sister tells me she did report him missing after he didn't call her on her birthday, something she said he would never do, never miss. Unfortunately, searches in multiple databases and other investigative tools over the years never made this connection. Still, they have it now, and she says she's forever grateful for some answers.
For the police to be able to do anything in this case, they need someone to come forward with information. Clifford not only deserves his name, but he deserves justice also. Clifford went unidentified for 34 years. Had he lived, he would be 80 years old today. The Cowdrey John Doe, identified as Jerry Mikkelson. The story of our John Doe begins on October 18, 1987, in Cowdrey, Jackson County, Colorado. It was here that a man was found 6 miles south of the Wyoming state line, off of a Forest Service access road. This was around 15 to 18 miles north of the city of Waldron, Colorado. The man was around 20 to 30 and around 5'9" or 175 centimeters. He had brown hair and brown eyes, as well as a mustache and a goatee. They were able to determine he had scars on his right cheek and right knee. He was wearing a 3/4 length coat, a brown windbreaker, a yellow sweatshirt, black pants, and hiking boots. So he was dressed rather casually, but not in a way that suggested he was homeless. His life had been taken only the day before, placing that date as October 17, 1987. When he was found, he also had on a vest that had the initials LBL. So they'd hoped these were his initials and they would break the case open. Sadly, they were not, and they did not. Nor did the titanium rod found in his femur. Someone had him and left him where he was. The detectives theorized his life was taken elsewhere, likely across the border in Wyoming. Soil samples taken from his hair were in fact traced to Wyoming. Investigators would exhume his remains in a hope that genetic genealogy would finally give him back his name, tracing some family members to Jerry Mikkelson. And once again, he was a man with a name. We know now that Jerry broke his femur 6 years before his life was taken, and this led to the titanium rod. We also know the initials on his clothing were not his. I can think of 4 or 5 cases off the top of my head that had the wrong names or initials on belt buckles, purses, jackets. Unfortunately, it just serves to send police in the wrong direction. Thankfully, Jerry Mikkelson once again has his name, and his family has the knowledge of where he went. He had taken off just a few days before his 20th birthday in 1983 from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The missing person report indicated they believed he'd spent time in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, as well as Kansas, Wyoming, and possibly Colorado. They believe he went willingly to the location that he lost his life, but no one knows exactly what happened. so they need people to come forward. So there's a gap of 4 years between when his life was taken and when he left from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Jerry went unidentified for 36 years, 12 years longer than he spent on this earth. He was found 644 miles, or 1,036 kilometers from home. Had he lived, he would be 60 years old today. The Trinidad Jane Doe, 1980, identified as Denise Cruz. We start now in Trinidad, California, which is located in Humboldt County. It was on February 11, 1980, that remains were found of a female who was estimated to have been there for around 3 weeks. She was likely 25 to 30, white, and around 5'9" or 175 centimeters. She had long reddish-brown hair and weighed around 145 to 175, which is about 66 to 79 kilograms. The woman had received a skin graft, where skin was taken from her right thigh and placed onto her right shoulder. They believe she also walked with a limp. There are postmortem pictures out there that you can find by searching the Doe Network. She was wearing men's corduroy pants, a gray turtleneck sweater that was marketed as men's clothing, and it had a name attached that said Arnold L. Peterson II on the inside. Underneath the sweater, she had on a homemade smock that was yellow, blue, and green flowers, as well as Nike shoes and men's socks. They determined the COD was an accidental OD, and there was no foul play. But without any local missing person report, they hit a brick wall. Her undergarments were men's corduroy Western-style tan pants, 34 by 30. She had on blue suede Nikes with white trim, size 9.5. Additionally, with her was a double-breasted rain jacket, a Sears sportswear jacket, a blue day pack that had Diane Mill, San Francisco, written on it. Additionally, she had 3 unmarked bottles with doxepin and flurazepam. I should probably touch quickly on those 2 meds because they may be a window into what was going on at the time. So keep in mind, Google is my answer for this, so I don't have any personal knowledge on this at all, but it looks like doxepin is primarily used for insomnia because it makes the user drowsy, but it was originally developed for depression. But then, of course, there are also off-label uses. It's a tricyclic antidepressant. It's from the first group of antidepressants that were developed in the 1950s, and they tend to have more side effects than the ones we take now. Usually now we use serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which you'll also hear referred to as SSRIs. Additionally, she had flurazepam in her system, which is a benzodiazepine. These are depressants that produce sedation and can relieve anxiety, muscle spasms, and reduce seizures. The current most commonly used benzodiazepines are Valium, Xanax, Halcyon, Ativan, and Klonopin, which I'm sure is pretty familiar to a lot of people. Neither of these medications had a prescription label with her, so it's impossible to know how she got them or why. It's possible she was self-medicating. It's hard to say. It also doesn't say exactly what caused her OD, whether it was these drugs. When she was found, she was in a wooded area inside of a sleeping bag. Funding for the DNA was done by Roads to Justice, and it was Othram Labs who made her identification. In August of 2023, her profile led to a man named Mark, who appeared to be the brother of our Jane Doe. He would explain that his sister had gone missing in September of 1979. This was 5 months before she was found. He provided his DNA, and it matched. Mark would share with investigators that Denise would have been 27 when she was found. It's not clear when he last saw her. It appears she was out of contact with her family. They had no idea what happened to her, believing she may have been living somewhere else. Denise Gayle Cruz went unidentified for 43 years. Had she lived, she would be 70 years old today. The Apache Junction Jane Doe, identified as Melody Harrison. The Apache Jane Doe has been identified, which is one of those cases that many of us have seen for a long time and have been rooting for identification. This one starts out in Apache Junction, Arizona, on August 6, 1992. She was found in a deserted area just south of US 60. She'd been there likely 3 to 10 weeks, and mummification is described. She had on blue denim cut-off Levi's, a t-shirt that said Team Gear on it, and a yellow metal ring with what's described as a nugget design on her left finger, although it didn't appear to be a wedding ring. She also had a hairband in her pocket and a yellow metal token that said valid for 1 student fare, Phoenix Transit System on it. Her COD was undetermined. The DNA Doe Project was approached by law enforcement handling her case, and they agreed to take the case on in 2018. Her DNA showed she was 1/4 African American, 1/2 Latin American, and was further complicated by her biological father, who was determined to be an adopted man born to an American serviceman stationed in Germany. They did note, however, that her mother was of Hispanic descent with ties to Pinal County, which is Arizona, and ties to Sonora, Mexico. When I covered this case originally, I included a long list of possible surnames. So rather than just rerun my original video, which that's not necessary now with the names, I opted to just save time and will just explain that they got to a bunch of names, but they had no JED matches. There were some issues with privacy changing during that time on GEDmatch, and there were less people to look from anyway. In her case, in 2020, 80% of the matches were hidden behind a wall in GEDmatch, and you had to opt in. So this sort of left the case in a holding pattern. It led the DNA Doe Project to put out the names and hope that maybe someone would come forward. Then in June of 2021, they got a slight break and they found a name of a close relative. But even though it came up on there, they weren't able to contact him, so they once again were in a holding pattern. Although they had that person's name, so they put out a plea, and eventually someone came forward and it worked, and they found the man in April of 2022. He would eventually be identified as our Jane Doe's uncle, but this was just the start of the twists and turns in this case. And this is all added into the fact that they find matches and move forward, find more and move forward. So they're constantly putting out DNA test kits and running the DNA in hopes of getting closer. And so in this case, when you have someone who was adopted, everything's a lot harder. They eventually figured out that 2 boys who were full brothers were adopted out to different families. They would come into contact with a cousin, and this would lead to a half-aunt. And that woman would explain for the first time that she had a half-brother that she found out about when she found a birth certificate that had been left by her father, who passed away. Her brother Bernard was born in 1953, and his mother was a German woman. His father was a black man who was serving in the military and was indeed stationed in Germany. His sister would share that while she knew she had a brother, she couldn't find him. However, the DNA Doe Project did. So in its own way, her case led to something good for someone else, despite the huge initial tragedy. The fact that both boys were born overseas just made it all that much harder, especially if someone was trying to trace the genealogical roots themselves. In this case, they had professionals. So when the DNA Doe Project approached her, she would tell them that she did not believe her brother could be found. And it does appear that his adoption was an overseas adoption. Either way, he wasn't living in Germany anymore. So while he was adopted over there, he was actually here in the U.S., in North Carolina. The woman was so defeated over trying to find her brother Bernard. All they had was his birthday and biological names. But that was all that the investigators needed for the U.S. Department of State to pull off something that had been impossible for his sister. The DNA Doe Project announced that the identification was due in part to the relentless efforts by Apache Junction investigator Stephanie Bourgeois, as well as genetic genealogy. Stephanie took the case over in 2008 and worked it all the way to the end. And this thankfully paid off, giving Melody Harrison her name back. Melody's age is shown on the screen here, but if anyone is listening only, I'll just say it's 3/4 of the way to 20. Melody's uncle, who helped drive the search for her name, was contacted and became very emotional when he learned that he had a niece who had gone unidentified for 30 years. He explained later that part of it was fueled by the fact that he had no biological family, that he knew of at all, to suddenly having a niece who had gone nameless for 30 years, saying this impacted him greatly. Truthfully, just typing the words I just said out loud while I was writing this up made me emotional myself. It's pretty incredible what they did in this case, and many good things came out of the bad. There's family now getting to know each other that wouldn't have otherwise. Press articles also state that they're looking to find Melody's biological father, in part for Melody's aunt and uncle, who have been searching for biological relatives. They know that he's half African American and German. possibly adopted by a military family with ties to New York, and they feel he deserves to know what happened to his daughter. The Apache Junction police say they've come so much farther than they ever thought was possible. Please call the number if you know anything more about this case. Melody Harrison was found only 35 miles or 56 kilometers from where she lived. She went unidentified for 31 years. Had she lived the life she deserved, she would be 46 years old today. The Harris County John Doe, March 2002, Houston, Texas. Identified as Hector Garcia. This story begins on February 4th, 2002, in Texas, when investigators were called to Spring Creek Bridge off of Kickapoo Road in Houston, Texas. A young man was found face down in a creek wearing tan and black Dockers brand windbreaker, a black and tan checkered Nautica shirt, polo jeans, and brown leather shoes. He was the victim of a gunshot wound to his chest. They believe he was really close to the age of legal adulthood, up to 32 years old. He had short black hair and a tattoo of 3 vertical Gothic-style letters on his left calf. The letters appear to be H, J, and either a D or a G. His clothing made it appear he was not homeless, and along with the tattoo, police were hopeful they would be able to identify him. However, that did not happen. In 2021, the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences submitted some forensic evidence in this case to Othram Labs in Woodlands, Texas. This is yet another case funded through a grant from Roads to Justice, which is always great to see, as funding is one of the biggest barriers in these cases. Othram's in-house forensic genetic genealogy team did the search itself in-house, although other cases might use their own genetic genealogy team, such as the team at DNA Doe Project. And with this, once again, Hector Jose Garcia had his name. He was not even quite an adult yet. His age displayed on the screen to avoid YouTube from turning my comments off again. He was born in November of 1985 in Hidalgo, Texas. He was known to be living in Galveston, Texas, which is where one of his parents were, and he was reported missing. Despite him being found only 50 miles or 80 kilometers away, he wasn't identified. But of course, missing teens are always a hot-button sort of topic. According to a 2021 report from findthekids.org, about 97.8% of the 500,000 children who go missing in the United States annually are found. That means each year about 511 of the 500,000 stay missing. So odds are in these cases they will be found, and that's probably plays in a lot to why there's been problems historically over the years with getting teens actively listed as missing. Another statistic states that 9 out of 10 are runaways. And of course there's also non-custodial parents versus runaways. There's all kinds of things that can go on. So for whatever reason, they didn't realize this was Hector, despite his being so close to home all this time. We know that Hector had gone to celebrate Mardi Gras with some of his friends. I imagine his family knew who he was with, and something happened to separate him from his friends. There's a lot that hasn't been released. If I find anything more, I will post it on the screen now. Hector Jose Garcia went unidentified for 21 years. Had he lived the life he deserved, he would be 38 years old today. The Wayne County Jane Doe, identified as Connie Christensen. We are starting this case in Wayne County, Indiana, on December 26, 1982. Some hunters were out hiking along Martindale Creek, north of Jacksonburg, Indiana. They would find remains off of a trail that looked really out of place. The woman wore high-heeled wooden clogs, a long-sleeved blue blouse, gray slacks, and they had a maternity stretch panel in them, as well as a blue jacket. It was obviously not something anyone would wear to go hiking on a trail, and this sort of added to the mystery of it all. She was likely 18 to 22, 5'3 to 5'7, or 160 to 170 centimeters. No COD could be determined, but they were sure that it was foul play, and she had likely been there for about half of a year. The police did all they could trying to trace the vendor of an opal ring that she was wearing, but they didn't get any leads, and they suspected she wasn't from the area. Over the years, they kept trying. In fact, they tried multiple times to get DNA, but it never succeeded. They had to wait for technology to advance further. The same was said for testing clothing for DNA, and so hopefully they may get more about who did this to her. The DNA Doe Project was kind enough to take this case, working alongside Astria Forensics, choosing to use genetic genealogy to try to crack this case. The DNA Doe Project got lucky, and they came up with 2 close family member matches. The team leader for this case, Lori Flowers, would say, taking a DNA test and uploading to GEDmatch is the best way for families of missing persons to help organizations like ours to make identifications. They were able to give a woman back her name and a family back the knowledge of why she disappeared. Connie Christensen was just 20 when someone took her life. The estimate of her age was spot on, with the true age landing directly in the middle of the 18 to 22 estimate. The worst part of the story is that Connie was a young mother, meaning there was a child out there who went 40 years looking for answers. I think those are nearly as victimized as the parents. It literally changes the lives of these kids. Connie was placed by an eyewitness in Tennessee in April of 1982, although she was actually from Oregon. Connie was found the same year that she went missing, and it's believed she was pregnant at the time, which would explain her maternity pants, and makes the person who did this even that much more evil. Although I suppose it's degrees of evil by now. She would say it was hard to go to school and tell people she didn't have a mom. It affected everything. She found herself in tears when the DNA Doe Project contacted her at her job, saying that they believed they'd solved it. She would say that she knew right away concrete confirmation with her DNA would be coming soon. They'd found her mom. Misty would say she always felt close to her mom. She'd asked a lot of questions of her family growing up, and her mom loved cats. She was an animal person, and her daughter would also grow up to love animals as well. She would say that she was given her mom's opal ring, which she now wears around her neck, along with some of her mom's ashes. She fell in love with opals when she was 12, and so it touched her that her mom loved them too. She said that it's not enough to just know what happened to her in the abstract. She needs to know what truly happened to her and who did this. So that means someone needs to contact the police to give more information. They announced to the public that the case is so old that the sheriff's office no longer has it, so the Indiana State Police are the ones that need to be contacted. They do know she was from Oregon and had been living in Wisconsin. She was supposed to return and never did, and it was at this time she was reported missing. Connie is described as being a free spirit who lived a somewhat transient lifestyle. But she loved her daughter, and when her daughter was left with her aunt watching her, no one expected that her mom wouldn't return. We know now that she was 450 miles or 724 kilometers from home, which is pretty far and just makes it that much harder to have matched them. Her family didn't even know where to look. It was further complicated by the fact that she left on her daughter Misty's birthday. One of Connie's 8 siblings remembers her saying goodbye, but not where she was going. The family was interviewed in 1992 by 27 News, allowing for some coverage of the case to be released in hopes that someone would come forward. Her sister would say as far as they knew she was still alive. While not elaborating with details, they would say that Connie had a hard life as she grew up, and she had in the past traveled with some carnivals, so they thought it was possible she was traveling with a carnival now, or at least when she left. She perhaps got in some sort of legal trouble, and that was why she was missing. They never fully considered the fact that she might no longer be alive. Now that her sister Diane knows and has some answers, she would say, so much of the time has passed and a lot of the people that may have been connected are probably no longer here. So that's kind of a dead end for us. Going on to share that her family is sad because Connie missed out on so much in life and the word closure doesn't apply in this case. That she never got to know her nieces, nephews, or her own daughter. They are now grieving and processing this specific outcome, one they didn't want but still needed in order to ever find a semblance of peace, saying they buried her ashes with her parents and younger brother, as well as planting an apple tree on their property to honor her on what would have been her birthday. Her family believes that she may have been trying to travel home via bus and ended up at the former bus station and diner in Indiana off Interstate 70 in Cambridge City when her life was taken nearby. Her family traveled to Wayne, Indiana to speak to the police, wanting answers as well as to see where she was found. Misty is sad that her grandparents passed without ever knowing what happened to Connie, but thankfully others who knew her could still join the memorial service and burial. Sometimes it seems easy to judge cases like this. After all, she left and she was pregnant, and there was probably increased danger in the actions that she was taking. But it's important to remember that she was 20. Probably a lot of us did some dumb things at 20. You think the world is a little bit different than it really is. I just mention this because I've had probably about half a dozen family members comment on videos, maybe a little bit more, and it's just important to remember somebody in their family who's hurting could see it. And she was so young, things could have turned around, who knows. It appears they may be onto something for finding the person who did this. A CT scan was made with 3D photos of every injury in hopes they may need it for court someday. And they came up with a person of interest who lives in Wisconsin and was a family acquaintance. However, he passed away himself shortly after he was interviewed. So it's not clear exactly what happened or if they found anything out. Whoever it was, the family provided the police with photos of Connie and this person when she was the age on the screen, and he was 30, which is already disturbing in and of itself. Making it worse, the man had a history of violent crime and had lived into his 80s. The police are pretty sure he's the culprit, but they're still hoping trace evidence or something else might let them close this case for sure. Connie Christensen went unidentified for 40 years. Had she lived the life she deserved, she would be 60 years old today. The Reno Jane Doe, 1997, identified as Lorena Gayle Mosley, also known as Lorena Sherwood. In June of 1997, rock climbers in Reno, Nevada, made the discovery of a woman buried under stones in a shallow grave. They made their way back to report what they found, and the examination would suggest she was between 35 and 45, and around 5'2" or 158 centimeters. She likely had brown hair, and at some point in her life, the left side of her mandible had fractured to the point that she needed a placement of a metal plate. Her COD couldn't be determined, but the conditions where she was found made it pretty clear someone had done this to her. The only other clues were dark blue dungaree trousers in a size 5.5, white athletic shoes and socks, as well as a black padded long-sleeved jacket with bright orange lining. Additionally, she had an Elgin brand watch, a black and silver coated metal ring with a magenta-colored stone, and the inscription 1992 and the word Oak Ridge. Additionally, there was a bolo tie and a metal whistle. Their investigation would hit a brick wall pretty quickly. The situation wasn't one that really lent itself to any clues other than the items found with her. They did enter her into NamUs, hoping for further information. This is yet another case solved by Othram Labs. In addition, there was a follow-up investigation done afterward by the Washoe County Regional Medical Examiner's Office, after which they were able to match her with fingerprints that had been taken previously. And they were able to match her fingerprints with some from a booking photo. As I say this, it sounds sort of like police messed up and didn't search correctly, but I want to make it clear there's no indication that's true. The prints themselves were on a paper document, not a digital one. And in this case, they only found them through genetic genealogy and being able to work backwards. So as far as her identification went, it was made on November 30th, 2023. Lorena Gayle Mosley also went by the last name of Sherwood, and she was 41 when someone took her life. They even had someone call in to say that his friend had confessed to doing this, but the caller didn't give his identification, and he didn't say who his friend was. There's a suspect, but not enough evidence so far. For this reason, like so many others, they need people to come forward. I provided a number to call if you have any idea. Lorena Gayle Mosley went unidentified for 26 years. Had she lived the life she deserved, she would be 67 years old today. The Indianapolis John Doe, 1993, identified as Alan Lee Livingston. Alan Lee Livingston was 27 and living in downtown Indianapolis. He had a family who loved him and missed him, and when they reported him missing, they would state he disappeared on August 6, 1993. They never gave up looking for him. In the early 1990s, the Marion County Sheriff's Office began investigating the cases of gay men going missing in the Indianapolis area. The men were pretty much of similar age, height, and weight. In 1992, 1 year before Alan went missing himself, a man identifying his name as Brian Smart would contact the Marion County Sheriff, saying he believed someone he often saw out in the bars took the life of a good friend of his, Roger Goodlett, who is currently missing. The man he was suspicious of said a lot of suspicious things about Roger, trying to figure out if anything was known about his case. However, he wasn't able to identify who the man was, and he also didn't give his real name. It turns out that Brian Smart was actually Tony Harris. More and more men in this area would go missing, but the families of Roger Goodlett and another man, Alan Wayne Roussard, would contact an investigator named Vandergriff, who had previously worked as a policeman, and it was he who would break the case wide open. He would send investigators to drinking establishments in the area that gay men were known to go to, that were known as pickup areas. And in fact, both of the men who'd gone missing had gone to this establishment, and others they believed to be related had gone missing from there also. The more they looked into it, it seemed that more and more men were missing than they even knew about. What his investigators learned was pretty alarming. Eventually, he was in contact with a man who reported a disturbing event that had happened to him, and that man thought it might be related to the missing men. He had gone home from the bar to a really fancy house on the outside of Indianapolis. The man who had picked him up would say that he was a groundskeeper for this home. The two drank and took what I'll describe as illicit substances, and the man who had given his name as Herb took a hose and wrapped it around his neck. He would say he was terrified and he pretended to pass out. Eventually the man realized that he was only faking it, but rather than repeat the event, he drove the man back into town. It doesn't appear he ever reported that event to the police, but it's important to remember that back then, when it came to same-sex crimes, there was fear of how it would be received by those who know them, or how it would be received by the police. That doesn't mean the Indiana police would have ignored his report, but it's just important to say there were a lot of factors that probably went into him not reporting. The man he did this to, who had gotten away, would say that he never forgot what happened, and he had watched for the man who had done this to him. And he would actually run into him again in another bar in the city. He jumped up on a table, screamed out that this guy was a serial killer, while pointing at him and yelling to get his license number. And someone did. They went and got his license number. It would be reported to the police, and they would discover the car was licensed to a man named Herbert Baumeister. He had actually given his real first name. And he wasn't a groundskeeper to that home, however, but he was a wealthy businessman who lived with his wife on an 18-acre property in Westfield, Indiana. It was August of 1995 when the police got the report about Baumeister, but so far there was just an allegation and no proof. They needed to get a search warrant or something along those lines in order to find more information, but judges in Hamilton County determined the informant was not credible enough as a witness to grant a search warrant. It may have been complicated by the fact that Baumeister was pretty wealthy and he owned 2 Save-A-Lot thrift stores in Indianapolis. Although they couldn't search, he was interviewed, and he claimed to the detective that he wasn't ever part of a bar scene. But of course they know his vehicle was at one of the bars in question. He then told police he was embarrassed and lied, not because he hurt anyone, but because his family didn't know about his activities. They did request to do a search on the property, but he refused, as did his wife. For a while, he was able to convince her that he was being unfairly targeted. They used aerial infrared to try to look down on the property to see if they could see anything, but they could not. And then Herb Baumeister's wife began questioning him about what was going on, and everything began falling apart. Their business was struggling, and their home was nearing foreclosure. She came forward to her attorney and shared with him that in early 1985, their son had actually found a skull and other bones on the property, and she had showed her husband where they were found. He told her the remains belonged to his father, and they were used for dissection and medical studies. She believed him, and Baumeister just told her he'd dispose of them somewhere else, and when his wife checked, they were gone. The attorney was bound by confidentiality, but strongly hinted to the police that they should keep looking. Herb Baumeister and his wife separated, and things just kept getting worse. In June of 1996, Baumeister's behavior got more and more erratic, and his wife became concerned for their kids. He closed one of their stores and grabbed his son and took him on an unplanned trip to a nearby lake that the wife and the kids used to go to frequently. The weird thing is, though, that Herb rarely went with them, instead staying behind, saying he needed to care for the store. although in retrospect, it was probably time for him to be able to go out and do what he wanted to do in the bars, rather than being with his family. So while he was gone with the kids, his wife would suddenly realize that he had drained their joint accounts. They were totally emptied. She feared he wasn't mentally stable, and she was concerned for her children. So it was at this point that she reversed herself and let the police search. As they walked the area where the children found the bones, the police would realize that there were bone fragments everywhere, all over the ground. Hundreds and hundreds of bones and teeth were found. So as the search was on, a judge forced Baumeister to hand over his son, saying they were afraid he would learn of the search and hurt the boy. However, this was in a different jurisdiction, and while they grabbed the boy, they did not arrest the man, even though they knew at this point that there were bones all over the property. Baumeister was now on the run, making his way to Canada while authorities were pretty close to the point where they would arrest him. As they closed in, he used an item starting with a G and ending with an N to escape paying for what he did to all those men, perishing from a wound to his head in Pinery Provincial Park in Canada on July 3, 1996. He even left a note, but infuriatingly enough, he did not bother to explain what was found on his property. Instead of giving closure to any of those people whose families are now grieving and suffering, he simply blamed his failing marriages and businesses for the act that he was going to take. The note was 3 pages written on yellow notepaper, and he apologized for messing up the park, for his marriage and his business failings. Yet he admitted to no crimes at all, although he did say this was the second location he meant to do it in. He had gone to the first location to take his own life, and there were children there, so he changed his mind. In 1999, they were able to assemble the remains of 8 men found on his property. 2 missing men, Broussard and Goodlet, were finally going home to their family. His wife would further explain the mystery of the monster she married, saying they were married for 25 years and were only intimate 6 times, and that her marriage wasn't great. He claimed he was embarrassed by how thin he was, and that was his reason for avoiding marital relations. From the outside, people thought everything was okay in the family, but it wasn't. Our John Doe in this case went unidentified with 3 others who were found. That is until Jeff Jellison was elected coroner in 2022. Jellison has made it his mission to try to identify the unidentified men who are still waiting. It was then that a new search of the property was ordered in December of 2022. They originally found 8 men, but the new search identified 20 possible new locations, as well as more bone fragments. The remains of 11 people have been found so far, with only 8 identified. The identified men deserve recognition too, so here they are as follows. Johnny Lee Bayer, known to his friends as Johnny. He was just 20 when he went missing on May 28, 1993, in Indianapolis. Jeffrey Allen Jones, known to his family as Jeff, was 31 when he went missing on July 6, 1993. Richard Douglas Hamilton Jr. was 20 when he went missing on July 31, 1993. Manuel Resendez was a children's counselor from Lafayette, Indiana, when the 31-year-old man was last seen at a downtown Indianapolis bar on August 6, 1993. I should mention, too, that our John Doe went missing on that same date, August 6, 1993, although it's not clear if they were all together at the same time. Stephen Sperlin Hale was 28 when he went missing on April 1, 1994. Alan Wayne Broussard was 28 when he went missing on July 6, 1994. Roger Allen Goodlet was just a little older, 33, when he went missing on July 22, 1994. Roger was last seen after he left his mother's residence where he lived to visit the same local bar where others had gone missing from in Indianapolis. In fact, 2 weeks before Roger disappeared, he was seen in the company of Herb Baumeister. The last identification I want to mention now is the last man known to have gone missing. From those identified, that is Michael Frederick Kieran, known to his friends as Mike. He was the oldest of the men whose remains were found. He was last seen on March 31, 1995, in downtown Indianapolis. A jacket belonging to Mike was found inside of Baumeister's residence. The disturbing thing, too, is that there were other missing men from that area at that time. I'll mention it again later, but it's super important for anyone to have gone missing from that area to have a family member come forward and offer their DNA to the police. they're going to still be testing more of the remains that were found. A big change came about with this case with the newly elected coroner, as I mentioned, Jeff Jellison, and he has really been pushing these cases. He would say he's making it his goal to use new DNA technology to identify the men, starting with today's John Doe. He didn't stop there, though. He would announce a new search on the property, including the release of the remains of Michael Kern, so his family can finally lay him to rest. They've had a marked plot for him for several decades, in hopes his remains would be released. The city was still holding on to them even though he'd been identified on June 15, 1999. I think it's natural to have questions too, not just about who the missing men are still on that property, as well as the particular monster who did what he did. If I had to guess in this case, I would think maybe his need for a male partner caused him embarrassment, and so he lived basically a fake life, doing the things that he felt he wanted to do in private. Of course, none of those things make you cruel. In the 1990s, it was still pretty normal for people to hide their orientation in order to avoid judgment of others. In this case, it seems like maybe hiding in the shadows sort of allowed him to hone his desires to hurt others. So maybe it was a game to Herbert Baumeister, and maybe it's even true that the first time was an accident. But this was not some sort of accidental repeat event. The authorities have since publicly linked the disappearance of Jerry Williams Comer. Comer was 34 when he was last seen in Indianapolis on August 8, 1995. His car was found at Castleton Square Mall. There was some suggestion that Baumeister was perhaps trying to recreate the first time he took someone's life with all of the others. What's sort of interesting about this, too, is that usually they seem to be preying on people who are on the street that won't be missed, but these men weren't hiding. They had families who loved them and weren't surprised by their orientation. They weren't at a higher risk because they were isolated from family. And maybe that thankfully in part led to his downfall. There's a very real possibility that there's a lot more men out there on that horse farm. So far, there have been over 10,000 teeth and bones recovered, and they are starting the very expensive and time-consuming process of trying to identify all of these tiny little bits and pieces. Many of the bones were burned, and of course he had broken them apart. Jellison has made it clear that the case is important to him, and more identifications will happen, so family members who think their loved one might be in these remains are asked to call him at 317-770-4415. Because Jellison had talked about this case before and wanting to identify them, Alan Livingston's mother saw it on the news and came forward and begged him to check to see if her son was in those remains. It turns out Sharon Livingston has terminal cancer, and she got the help of Alan's cousin to send her DNA to the authorities in hopes of finding a match before her battle was over. So out of those 10,000 fragments, they chose 40 to be processed for DNA because of the cost. And those were compared to Sharon's DNA that she donated. Sharon would wait along with her nephew Eric Pranger, hoping that they might finally find Alan. And shockingly, one out of those samples was Alan Livingston. The odds were pretty much against that ever happening. Her nephew would say that he's happy Sharon got some closure, but he's sad because they got confirmation that it's Alan, saying, "We were all just hoping Alan was out there alive somewhere, but he's not." And truly, that is the limbo that these families live in. They sit there wanting the knowledge, and they can't help but hoping they're wrong, but at the same time, they want to know. What further complicates things is those remains in the property weren't the only ones found to believe to be caused by Baumeister. Other men who were partially clothed were found somewhere else in shallow water in central Indiana and Ohio around the time that he's believed to have been targeting men. Police have suspected Baumeister of being the I-70 strangler who was active between 1980 and 1981, targeting 19 young men who were the victims of SA and then dumped near Interstate 70 in Indiana and Ohio. Most of these in that case were part of the LGBTQ community who had disappeared within a 4-block radius in Indianapolis. So they were very linked to each other. I look forward to being able to cover more of these identifications in the future. I can't find follow-ups as to any more searching that was done after they identified the 20 possible spots that they thought remains could be in, so it's possible there's even more. The person who owns the horse farm now has been very accommodating and respectful of what's happened. He says he's very aware and mindful of what might be out in the woods behind his home. Alan Lee Livingston is the 9th victim so far, but Jellison reports that they feel they could have as many as 25 people in the end who will be identified. More than 30 families so far have provided DNA and are waiting results. Jellison has been open about how thankful he is that Alan's remains were the first to be identified. The odds of being able to give Sharon Livingston an answer before she passed should have been nearly impossible, but it happened. I wish I could tell you more about Alan, but the truth is I don't know a lot about his life. What I know is that his family loved him, and they missed him, and they never forgot him. Alan Lee Livingston was missing for 33 years. He was an unidentified John Doe for 30. Had he lived the life he deserved, he would be 57 years old today. Huge thanks for watching all the way to the end, and a big thanks to all of you who consistently like and comment on the videos. Whether you leave a full comment or an emoji, it makes a huge difference. So if you consistently watch my videos, maybe take a moment to subscribe. It's a huge push toward the videos being suggested to new people. The next goal is 20,000. Thanks everyone for watching. Take care of yourselves and each other.